Hey guys, Paul here. Welcome to another mini edition of the Baseball Dad Show. And in this edition, we're going to talk about the two things that you might hear from a baseball coach that you should never, ever, ever believe. Before we do that, head on over to baseballdadshow.com. There's a ton of great stuff there. We have a scorecard that can tell you if your son's ready to play at the next level. We have a cut and paste email dialogue that you can use to ask your son's coach for more playing time, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So head on over to baseballdadshow.com. So I speak a lot to parents and to a lot of times to coaches, but more and more I'm really only accepting speaking engagements to address parents because that's really what I'm passionate about. And in every talk that I give to parents, I say there's always two things that your son might be told, and you should never believe either of them. And those two things are your son is elite or your son is not elite. Now I'm going to talk about both of them, but the problem I have with it is definition of the word elite. So usually when we're talking about that, we're talking about a kid that is trying out for a program or is being recruited or some kind of process where he's being evaluated, and someone's going to say, you are at this level where you can be part of this elite program, or you're not at this level that you cannot play at this elite program. So I have no problem with great and aggressive marketing. I think that's an important part of business. Great companies we admire, Starbucks, Apple, they are all aggressive marketers. And I have no problem with that. And that's usually the word elite is usually used to trigger a marketing event, to trigger a sales event, that your son is elite, therefore you should be in a program like this. And usually what happens after a dad being told his son is elite is he's presented an opportunity for his son to demonstrate his elite ability, and it will only cost him, a few $1,000s or more, a lot more. So I don't have a problem with aggressive marketing. What I do have a problem with is marketing that categorizes people as superior than others. And so they prey on that, a dad saying, wow, my son has a superior ability, let me make the most of it. Okay, so if your son is labeled elite, or your son is labeled not elite, elite is not the definition, right? How they really should be labeled is this: your son is early genetic developer, or your son is a late genetic developer. Because elite and not elite says one is good, one is bad, right? When it's really not. It's really neither. It's one is early developer and one is late developer. So let me talk to both groups. Why you should never believe a coach who says that your son is elite. We talked about that. Usually right after that comes a big bill for a couple $1,000s or more. But here's the second thing that happens. If your son is labeled elite and your son is not elite, there's no such thing as an elite 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10-year-old. They can't possibly be elite because they are literally developing and maturing at a rate that very little skill can be developed and held on to. And in lies the problem. When your son is labeled elite, what usually happens next is your son is thrust into a team or a program that's going to go play a bunch of games and a bunch of tournaments. And your son is going to spend the next few years doing a lot more playing than he is practicing and developing. And what he's going to use as his primary source to compete and succeed is his early genetic development. So some kids, they look like they're 13 when they're 9. When they look 18 when they're 12. They're 5'10" when that just happens, right? Some kids are early developers. I'll tell you, for me, I was 5'10" and a half when I was a sophomore in high school. And at 45 years old today, as I'm recording this, I am 5'10" and a half. I have not grown a single hair since then. I like to say I'm 5'11", sometimes 6 feet, but you know how that goes. So the problem with that is your son is now using his early genetic development, that he's just bigger, faster, stronger, at a quicker rate than other kids, as the tool to succeed. And what oftentimes gets suspended is development. And so now, let me just pause that there, is that kid doesn't develop at the rate that he should be. His game doesn't develop. He's just relying on bigger, faster, and stronger. And I've said this a million times on this podcast. We see it in the Little League World Series. We don't see the pitchers and the players that 12 years old in the Little League World Series 20 years later in the big leagues. We just don't see it. It just doesn't happen. The 12-year-old doesn't show up as a 22-year-old a decade later dominating the big leagues. I know there are a few, but they're few and far between. I think there's only 20-some-odd kids total in the history of the Little League World Series to play in the big leagues. And that is a big number considering how many players have played in Williamsport. So what happens now is that player, when that player turns 12, 13, or 14, and I know this because I talk to the dads who are now 12, 13, or 14, all of a sudden now the other kids have caught up to their early genetic development. So now they were bigger, faster, and stronger earlier. Now most of the kids have caught up, and now they they find themselves a little bit behind the curve on development. They don't have the skills of the game that were needed, and now the thing that they were using to succeed, their early bigger, faster, stronger development, is now becoming less and less and less effective. So now let's take the kid who says you're not elite. Okay, so you're not elite. So now what happens is that kid doesn't have the competitive opportunities that he needs, because so much of our 12 and under baseball is really geared towards this elite designation and cuts off the player that, maybe is a late developer, and then he develops when he's 12, 13, and 14, 15. So now when we get to like age 13, 14 with both of these groups, we get one player who is now can't use his great genetic ability, excuse me, and has lagged on his developmental ability. And then we have one player that doesn't have the competitive development and maybe didn't have the opportunities to really develop that. What we end up with is a lot of mush around like 13 or 14, all because early on, somewhere in the process of 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, both players were labeled either or. You're this or that. You're elite or you're not. And that designation is the problem. There are no such thing as an elite 8, 9, 10, or 11-year-old players. There are early genetic developers and late genetic developers. So here's my message to the dads who you've been told that your son is elite. Number one, set boundaries and standards to how much your kid is going to play and how much your kid is going to develop. Never commit to more than 3 months at a time. So you're going to play the spring, and then we'll evaluate after the spring if we're going to continue. We're going to play the summer, and then you tell your coach we're going to evaluate after the summer. This way you don't get caught in an endless cycle of playing. Number two, make sure that you're balancing out his playing time and his development time, because coaches will want that bigger, faster player because he's kind of like ready-made, right? I call these players iPhones and Polaroids. An early developing player is like an iPhone. We pull it out, click, it's developed. A late developing player is like a Polaroid. We click, a picture comes out, and then we have to sit there and wait like a half hour for it to develop. And so what happens is the 9-year-old elite travel ball coach, he sees a late developing player and says, look, you're a good kid, but I got to win 10 tournaments this year. I just don't have time to take you on my team and develop you. So for the dad who has the elite player, set boundaries and set development times. For the dad who has the son who's labeled not elite, what you need to do, you're going to have plenty of development opportunities because you can obviously invest in those as you go. But what you have to do is you have to search as best you can to get as many competitive opportunities as he can, and take every and all competitive opportunities that you can expose your son to. So maybe it's not elite, maybe it's rec ball, maybe you got to travel a little bit to play in a league, and maybe that league isn't so great. I get it. I know that the leagues are are there's some quality issues in the leagues. Excuse me, but sorry guys, I got some allergies this week. But take your main objective, if your son has been labeled not elite, is keep him in the game and keep as many opportunities as you can. The other things that I would tell you to do is a great secondary sport to baseball is tennis. If you can learn, basically tennis, serving is pitching, returning is hitting, and moving around, like if you can master the skills of tennis, it's almost like working on the game of baseball side by side. I never had a problem with a baseball player who was also a tennis player because they had so many base, fundamental, foundational skills and the strength and the movement patterns already ingrained. So again, shorter podcast, but take this and run with it, guys, because it's just, remember, there are no elite players. There are early developers and late developers. And here you now, from this podcast, know exactly what you have to focus on if your son has been labeled either of those. So thanks for listening, guys. Love you guys. Thank you. Head on over to Baseball Dad Show and check out everything we have there for you. And I'll see you guys next week.